In the summer of 2023, I booked an Airbnb for a week-long getaway in a quiet valley outside a small town in Montana. The listing was described as a charming off-grid cabin, surrounded by miles of forest. The reviews were glowing, hundreds of 5-star ratings praising the peaceful retreat and the hospitality of the host. It sounded perfect for the solitude I needed after a hectic year. When I arrived, the cabin was everything the listing promised. It was a cozy one-room structure with a wood stove, no electricity, and a small loft for sleeping. The nearest neighbor was the host, but their house was about half a mile up a dirt road, and they were apparently out of town. I liked the idea of being completely alone. The first evening was uneventful. I cooked dinner on a small propane stove, sat on the porch listening to the sounds of the forest, and read by candlelight until I got tired. Around 10 p.m., I climbed up to the loft and fell asleep quickly. At some point in the middle of the night, I woke up to a loud thump against the side of the cabin. It wasn't the sound of something falling or a tree branch hitting the roof. It was deliberate, almost like a fist hitting the wall. Groggy and startled, I sat up, trying to listen. My first thought was that it might be an animal, but it didn't sound like scratching or pawing. It was just one loud, purposeful hit. I stayed still for a few minutes, waiting, but everything was silent. Eventually, I convinced myself it was nothing and went back to sleep. The next night, things got stranger. Around the same time, just after midnight, I heard it again. This time, it wasn't a single hit. It was 2 loud bangs, followed by a scraping sound along the side of the cabin. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, shining it around the loft and down to the ground floor. Nothing seemed out of place, and I didn't hear any movement outside. I was freaked out but told myself it was probably just a branch scraping the wood in the wind. The third night was when everything escalated. I was in bed, scrolling on my phone, trying to ignore how tense I felt. The night was completely silent. Then, just past midnight, I heard footsteps outside, clear, deliberate crunches on the gravel path that led to the front door. I froze. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. I stared at the entrance, my heart pounding, as the doorknob rattled. Someone was trying to open it. I didn't have any weapons, so I grabbed the closest thing I could find, a heavy candlestick, and shouted, "Who's there? I'm calling the police." The rattling stopped, but then I heard footsteps again, circling the cabin. A few seconds later, the footsteps paused beneath the small loft window. The window was too high for anyone to look through without a ladder, but I could hear breathing. Someone was standing just outside. Panic surged through me. I turned off my phone flashlight, slid into the far corner of the loft, and waited. The breathing stopped, but I didn't hear them walk away. I sat there, clutching the candlestick, too scared to even move. Minutes felt like hours. Eventually, I heard the footsteps retreat, heading toward the forest. I waited until I was sure they were gone before grabbing my bag and climbing down. I didn't even pack properly. I just grabbed my essentials, ran to my car, and drove straight to the nearest town. The next morning, I reported the incident to the police. They searched the property but didn't find anyone. There were no signs of forced entry, but they did find footprints around the cabin and beneath the loft window. The host seemed genuinely shocked when I told them what happened. They offered me a partial refund and insisted they'd never had any issues before. To this day, I have no idea who was outside my cabin or what they wanted. All I know is that I'll never stay in an isolated Airbnb again. Earlier this year, my wife and I decided to take a short vacation and found an Airbnb in a quiet, wooded area near the Appalachian Mountains. The listing showed a small, modern cabin with sleek furniture and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the forest. The host had excellent reviews and was described as friendly and accommodating, so we booked it for a long weekend. The check-in process was smooth. The key was in a lockbox, and the cabin was just as beautiful as the photos. It felt secluded but safe, with other cabins visible through the trees. On the first evening, we noticed something odd, a faint, musty smell in the living room. At first, we thought it might be the rug or the couch, but no amount of air freshener helped. It wasn't unbearable, just strange. The next morning, while I was making coffee, my wife called me over to the living room. She had been browsing through a cabinet under the TV and found a binder labeled guest book. Inside were handwritten notes and reviews from previous guests. Most of them were the usual things, comments about the lovely scenery, the comfortable bed, or how much they enjoyed their stay. But one entry, dated just a week before our arrival, stood out. It was short and vague, written in shaky handwriting. "Thank you for the stay. It was peaceful, though I had an unsettling experience on my last night. Someone knocked on the door around midnight. When I checked, no one was there. Please let future guests know to double-check the locks at night." I laughed nervously and showed it to my wife. "Probably just some prank," I said, trying to sound nonchalant, but she looked uneasy. That night, we made sure all the doors and windows were locked before going to bed. The cabin was equipped with a basic security system, including a motion-activated light outside, which reassured us. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a faint noise. It wasn't loud, more like a shuffle or a creak, as if someone was walking on the wooden deck outside. I froze and listened, my pulse quickening. My wife stirred beside me. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. The sound stopped, and everything went silent except for the rustling of the wind in the trees. "Probably an animal," I whispered back. "A raccoon or something." She nodded, but neither of us went back to sleep right away. The next morning, as we stepped outside to enjoy the crisp air, I noticed something strange near the front door. The motion light had mud smears on the lens, as if someone had deliberately covered it. I tried to brush it off as a coincidence. Maybe the wind had blown dirt onto it, or maybe it had been like that before we arrived. But the thought nagged at me. Later that day, as we were heading out for a hike, I noticed something else. Faint scuff marks on the cabin's deck near the back door. The marks weren't from shoes. They were too irregular, almost like someone had dragged something heavy across the wood. I didn't mention it to my wife, not wanting to scare her. That evening, as we were sitting in the living room, the motion light outside flickered on and off. My wife jumped, and I got up to check the front door. When I looked outside, no one was there, but the light kept flickering as if something was moving near it. I decided to call the host to report the issue. He picked up quickly, sounding concerned. I explained the light flickering and mentioned the muddy lens. There was a pause before he said, "I'm sorry about that. The last guest mentioned something similar, but I didn't find anything when I checked the property. Could just be wildlife." I asked about the guest's note in the binder, and the host hesitated again. That guest, well, they left in a bit of a hurry, said they felt uneasy, but didn't give me details. I've never had any trouble up there before. His response didn't sit well with me, but I thanked him and hung up. That night, the sound of footsteps returned. Slow, deliberate, and closer than before. I grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen and stood by the front door, my heart pounding. This time, when I opened the door, I saw muddy footprints leading up to the porch. The prints were large, barefoot, and uneven, as if someone had been limping. They stopped just a few feet from the door. We didn't stay another night. The next morning, I left the host a detailed message about what we'd experienced and sent him photos of the footprints. He didn't reply immediately, but when he did, his response was brief. "Thanks for letting me know. I'll look into it. Sorry for the trouble." The listing was taken down a few weeks later. I never found out what happened, but I can't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching us during our stay. Last summer, my girlfriend and I booked a week-long stay at an Airbnb in the outskirts of Santa Fe, New Mexico. We were excited about the trip, an opportunity to disconnect and explore the scenic trails and art galleries in the area. The listing was for a small, rustic adobe house at the end of a gravel road. It was surrounded by open desert, with only a few other properties visible in the distance. The host had glowing reviews, describing her as attentive and quick to respond. When we arrived, everything seemed fine. The house was cozy, with southwestern decor and large windows offering beautiful views of the desert. A binder on the kitchen counter provided instructions for using the appliances and local recommendations. On our second day, while relaxing in the living room, my girlfriend noticed a small, locked door in the hallway. It was about the size of a pantry door but had no visible handle, just a padlock securing it. Storage closet, maybe? I guessed. She nodded but seemed uneasy. It's just weird they didn't mention it in the listing. Usually, they say something like host storage, off limits. It didn't bother me at first, but as the days went on, I found myself glancing at the door more often than I'd like to admit. It was oddly placed, smack in the middle of the hallway, as if demanding attention. On the fourth night, we were sitting on the patio, watching the sunset, when my girlfriend suddenly asked, "Did you hear that?" I listened but heard nothing. It sounded like something fell inside the house. We went back inside and looked around but didn't find anything out of place. I joked that maybe it was the house settling, but she didn't laugh. That night, as we were lying in bed, I woke up to a faint sound, like a soft, rhythmic thumping. It wasn't loud, but it was steady enough to make it impossible to ignore. I nudged my girlfriend awake. "Do you hear that?" She listened for a moment and nodded, her eyes wide. "It's coming from the hallway." I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, then slowly opened the bedroom door. The sound stopped immediately. The hallway was dark and empty, the locked door looming at the end. We didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I decided to message the host. I phrased it carefully, asking if the house had any quirks we should know about, like noisy pipes or strange sounds. She replied quickly, "No, nothing like that. I've never had any complaints before. Is everything okay?" I told her about the noises, and she apologized profusely, suggesting it might be the wind or an animal outside. She assured me the house was safe and encouraged us to enjoy the rest of our stay. Her response was polite, but it didn't sit right with me. That afternoon, while my girlfriend was napping, I decided to take a closer look at the locked door. I examined the padlock. It was old and rusted, like it hadn't been touched in years. The edges of the door frame were scuffed, as if someone had tried to pry it open. I gave the door a gentle push, and to my surprise, it moved slightly. The padlock was secured, but the wood around it had started to splinter, leaving just enough give for the door to shift if pressed. I leaned in to listen and thought I heard a faint rustling sound, like fabric brushing against something. When my girlfriend woke up, I told her what I'd found. She was upset, insisting we call the host or leave immediately. I tried to reassure her, saying it was probably just an old storage room with a draft. That night, the thumping returned, louder this time. It was accompanied by another sound, a low creaking, like the floorboards under the door were being pressed down. We both sat upright in bed, staring at the door to our room. "I'm not staying here another night," she whispered. We grabbed our essentials and left the house in the middle of the night, driving to a motel in town. The next morning, I sent the host a long message explaining everything and included a photo of the splintered doorframe. She didn't respond for hours, and when she finally did, her tone was different, cold, almost dismissive. "The door is locked for a reason," she wrote. "You should not have touched it. I'll inspect the house, but I've never had issues before. Please do not contact me again." A week after our trip, I checked the listing out of curiosity. It was still active, but now had a new note in the description. Please respect all locked areas of the property. They are not for guest use. I don't know what was behind that door, and honestly, I don't want to know. Whatever it was, it felt like we weren't alone in that house. When I booked an Airbnb in a small town outside of Denver, I wasn't expecting anything extraordinary, just a quiet weekend away from the chaos of the city. The listing showed a charming 2-bedroom house, recently renovated, with a backyard patio that overlooked the woods. The reviews were mostly positive, though a few mentioned that the area could feel a little too remote at night. The host, Lisa, was friendly and responsive. She sent me the check-in instructions right away, explaining that the key would be in a lockbox on the porch. Everything seemed normal. I arrived on Friday afternoon. The house was as advertised, clean, well-furnished, and cozy. The only thing that felt off was how isolated it was. The nearest house was about half a mile down the road, and there was no cell reception unless I stood near the kitchen window. But I brushed it off. After all, that was part of the charm of getting away, right? The first night passed uneventfully. I cooked a quick dinner, watched a movie, and went to bed early. The silence was unnerving at first, but I eventually drifted off. It was the second night when things started to get strange. Around 10 p.m., I was sitting in the living room scrolling through some offline articles on my tablet when I heard a loud thud. It sounded like something heavy had hit the side of the house. I froze, listening. A few seconds later, I heard it again, this time from the back of the house. I got up, grabbed my phone, even though I knew it wouldn't work without signal, and cautiously peeked out the window. Nothing. The backyard was dark, illuminated only by the faint glow of the porch light. Telling myself it was probably a branch falling or an animal, I went back to the couch. But the uneasy feeling lingered. About an hour later, I decided to call it a night. As I was brushing my teeth, I heard another noise, this time a faint creak, like a door opening. My heart started pounding. I checked the front door. Locked. The back door? Locked. I searched the house, but everything seemed in place. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That night, I barely slept. The next morning, I stepped outside to take a better look around. The grass in the backyard was wet from the morning dew, and that's when I noticed something odd: footprints. They were faint but definitely human, leading from the woods right up to the back door. I felt a chill run down my spine. I hadn't gone into the backyard since I'd arrived, so those couldn't be mine. I texted Lisa, "Hi, just wanted to ask, does anyone else have access to the house? I noticed some footprints near the back door this morning." She replied quickly, "No, you're the only guest this weekend. I'll have someone come by to check the area tomorrow morning." That was reassuring enough, though it didn't explain the footprints. I decided to go into town for lunch and to clear my head. When I came back in the early afternoon, I noticed something strange. The back door, which I had double-checked before leaving, was unlocked. I stood there for a moment, debating whether to go inside or call someone. But who would I call without cell reception? And the nearest police station was miles away. Summoning my courage, I stepped inside. Everything looked the same as I'd left it. But as I walked through the house, I realized something small but unsettling. Some of the cabinet doors in the kitchen were open. I was certain I'd closed them earlier. I spent the rest of the day with all the curtains drawn, jumping at every little sound. That evening, as the sun began to set, I noticed a movement in the woods. At first, I thought it was a deer or a coyote, but when I looked closer, I saw a figure. A man, partially obscured by the trees, watching the house. I froze, my heart racing. He stood there for what felt like an eternity before turning and disappearing into the woods. I texted Lisa again. "There's someone in the woods behind the house. I'm not comfortable staying here. Can you call someone?" This time, it took her longer to respond. When she did, her message only added to my fear. "I'm sorry to hear that. I'll refund your stay. Please leave the key in the lockbox when you go." That was it. No reassurance, no explanation. I packed my bags in record time, keeping a kitchen knife within reach the entire time. As I locked the front door and placed the key back in the lockbox, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The house stood dark and silent, but I thought I saw a faint light flicker in one of the windows. I never heard from Lisa again. When I later checked the listing, it had been taken down. It started as a much-needed getaway. My girlfriend Sarah and I had been working long hours, and a weekend in the Catskills seemed like the perfect escape. The Airbnb listing showed a rustic cabin with modern amenities, nestled between a creek and a dense forest. The photos promised cozy evenings by the fire and peaceful mornings on the porch with coffee. The host, Greg, seemed friendly. His messages were prompt and detailed, though he mentioned something odd in his last message. "The neighboring cabin isn't part of the listing, but don't worry, it's usually unoccupied." Usually? Sarah had repeated when I showed her the message. What does that mean? I shrugged it off, probably just a way of saying we'd have privacy. When we arrived late Friday afternoon, the place was exactly as advertised. The cabin was spotless, with a welcome basket on the counter and a note from Greg. "Enjoy your stay. Call if you need anything." We unpacked, settled in, and spent the evening making dinner and playing cards. The next morning, we decided to take a hike. As we passed the neighboring cabin on the way to the trailhead, I noticed something strange. It didn't look abandoned. There was a truck parked out front, and a light was on in the living room. "Guess someone's staying there after all," Sarah said. We didn't think much of it and continued our hike. When we returned that afternoon, the truck was gone, and the cabin looked empty again. But as we sat on the porch enjoying the last of the daylight, we noticed movement. A curtain in one of the windows shifted slightly, as if someone had been watching us and stepped away. "That's weird," Sarah said, her voice uneasy. I tried to brush it off. Probably the wind or a loose rod. Old cabins do that. That night, we were sitting in the living room, the fire crackling, when we heard footsteps on the porch. Clear, deliberate steps. I froze. Sarah looked at me, her eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" I nodded. Slowly, I got up and peered out the window. There was no one there, but the welcome mat had been moved, shifted a few inches to the left. I locked the door and double-checked all the windows. "Probably just an animal," I said, more to reassure myself than her. We went to bed, though neither of us slept well. Around 2 a.m., we both woke up to a noise, a faint tapping, like someone was knocking on the window. I grabbed my phone, but of course, there was no service this deep in the woods. "Stay here," I whispered to Sarah, grabbing the flashlight from the bedside table. I stepped into the living room and shone the light around. The tapping had stopped, but the back door, which I knew I'd locked, was slightly ajar. My heart raced as I shut and locked it again, sliding a chair under the doorknob for good measure. When I got back to the bedroom, Sarah was sitting up, her face pale. "I swear I saw someone outside," she said. "A man. He was standing by the tree line." I didn't see anyone when I looked, but her fear was contagious. We spent the rest of the night huddled together, jumping at every creak and gust of wind. By morning, we decided we'd had enough. We packed our bags and were ready to leave when we noticed something chilling. The chair I'd placed under the doorknob was moved, and the back door was unlocked again. We got in the car and drove straight to town. As soon as we had cell service, I called Greg to tell him what had happened. His response made my blood run cold. "There's no way anyone was there," he said. "The neighboring cabin's been abandoned for years. That truck you saw? Probably just a local hunter parking there to use the trail. But no one lives there. Not anymore. When I pressed him, he added almost reluctantly, "There used to be a caretaker who stayed there. A real odd guy. After some incidents, we stopped using him and the place has been locked up ever since. But I promise, no one's supposed to be there." I didn't have the energy to argue. We drove home, both of us shaken.